quick. I want to thank you all for coming in today. I'm going to read some quick introductions to everybody. So first off, we're going to start off with my friend Elizabeth Molitor. Elizabeth is the owner and principal consultant of the Art of Work Consulting, where she offers coaching and consultative services to organizations, professionals, and job seekers. She previously served as a director of staffing services at Peak Performers, where she engaged with teams to provide satisfying performance job opportunities for individuals with disabilities. She holds a master's degree in human dimensions and organizations from the University of Texas at Austin, and currently serves on the advisory board for the HDO program. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Excited to talk to everybody.
We're excited to have you. And next up, we have Beth Fidel. Beth Fidel is the Executive Director of Disability in North Carolina, and she has over 25 years of experience providing subject matter expertise to Fortune 50 companies in ADA accommodations process and disability inclusion strategies. Legally blind since birth, Beth leverages her lived experience both personally and professionally to challenge what companies think and how they act and lead differently. Beth, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And finally, we're going to be finishing it up with Chauncey. So Chauncey recently retired. Congrats, Chauncey. We managed to catch him right before he has 2 feet out the door going for a vacation. And we were so excited for him, but we're so glad that he stopped by to provide his expertise. Chauncey has previously worked for Wells Fargo and still serves as the ex officio board member for Disability in North Carolina. With over 25 years of management experience, Chauncey has led a diverse organization of approximately 450 employees who are accountable for the image capture, scanning, indexing, and research documents in support of various lines of business for Wells Fargo. Born with limited hearing in his left ear, Chauncey has a passion for working with and hiring people with disabilities. Chauncey, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us, Miles. Looking forward to the conversation.
What are people with disabilities looking for in their managers? What are they looking for?
You know, Aaron said it at the beginning of the introduction of this topic, right? The same thing that most everybody is looking for, right, in an employer. The opportunity to use your talents and your skills and your experience to improve an organization's environment, but just bring your skills and talents to an organization. We're looking for opportunities for growth, for promotional opportunities, advancement, development as a professional, not unlike anybody, right, that is looking for an employment opportunity. Again, a place where you feel valued and where your contributions matter. That's really it, I think. When I look back at my early career, I wanted to know that I was contributing to something bigger than myself, I think, and that sounds really pie in the sky, right? And maybe it was, but I remember an early conversation I had with a gentleman that had just recently retired from the company that I had just started at. And he looked at me and I said, I want to know what the heart of that organization is about. And that was important to me. What is the heart of that organization? And we have mission and value statements and all of those things. But really quickly when you enter an employment situation where the heart of that organization sits. And he looked me in the eye and he said, and I said, I don't know the heart of this organization. And he looked me in the eye and he said, then you know what? You go find it and you bring it back. And so, right, that was my challenge. But again, we want to, you want to feel valued and you want your contribution to matter.
I know I certainly do, right? I joke that, disability hiring is human hiring and disability management is human management because that's what we're ultimately looking for. The funny thing the thing that I feel is that a lot of people get wrong is that they start with the disability. And yes, that can be a prominent part of the personality and our whole worldview, but I like to think that most of us probably see ourselves as human first. Elizabeth, has that been your experience kind of managing a lot of people with disabilities?
Yeah, I would have probably said, not word for word, but so close of an answer that would mimic Beth's very much, just in terms of you want to feel respected, you want to feel included, you want to feel engaged, you want to feel fulfilled in your job, you want to feel like you have opportunities for assignments and to grow. I think the thing, that maybe she didn't mention that I've been thinking also as I was listening is what you don't want. So you don't want to feel like an other. You don't want to feel like an exception. You don't want to feel like you're being seen for your disability or having that have too much relevance in what you're achieving. So you want to be seen for the qualities that you embody as an employee and as a successful employee. And you want your manager to listen and be supportive of that.
Sometimes accommodations might be viewed as special treatment by other employees that don't understand the full context of exactly why an accommodation is being afforded to an individual. As a person that's managed, a ton of people previously, how do you manage that perception and some of those weird politics that might come up in the workplace when people feel like there might be special treatment that's being afforded a person?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, to echo the sentiment that's already been outlined, is it's really not any different, right? So we all require some level of accommodation training that to assist us with learning our jobs. And so in my organization, typically I set the expectation from the top, so my chair going down. And so it's really about helping their employees understand that the expectation from this individual is going to be the same as it is for everyone at the end of the day, right? And so as a leader, the expectation is that we'll make accommodations. It may be for people that have challenges with seeing or hearing or maybe autistic. The reality of it is that at the end of the day, their performance, that output is expected to be the same. And so when I've had issues from employees that say, hey, why are we doing this for this employee? I usually take the time, and more importantly, I train and teach my leaders and within my organization to understand the importance of what the output will be, right? And I think if you're building that culture a little more organically, it really, in my experience, it's just really is filtered throughout the organization. So yes, those fears exist. Within my organization, I've championed the hiring of people with disabilities, and I've been surprised that in this day and age, right, I've said often 2023, 2024, 2025, that I'm having to explain to middle level managers that this is why this work is important. But really, at the end of the day, we're people. We're people with disabilities. We expect all the things that Beth and Elizabeth touched on in terms of what employees are looking for in a manager. I would just echo to say, we shouldn't be barriers as well as leaders. We shouldn't not only not harm, but also encourage and promote. We shouldn't be a hindrance to individuals being able to achieve their goals. And so really in educating the staff, the broader staff, on the importance of us all needing some level of accommodation in terms of patience. It might be a timing. We may learn differently. It may not necessarily be a disability, but it may be that you're more of a visual learner or more of an all hands learner, where someone else more, learns from, reading a textbook. Right. And so usually I kind of make those live examples and bring those to the forefront for employees when those issues have come up, those opportunities will come up. And it usually works out in our favor in terms of the overall staff.
You yourself may use an accommodation without even quite realizing it, right? A lot of things that are accommodations actually came from specific disability adaptations that have been developed. Case in point, the touchscreen for the iPhone was originally developed for people with disabilities from an accessibility need, and now all of us use it, right? So we don't, going back to Elizabeth's point of an other, it's not so much an other group of people with an other set of needs. These are just basic needs. These are basic human needs. And the more that we can kind of think about that, the better. Sometimes accommodations are going to be a little bit more obvious. So like Beth, I was wondering if you might be able to share, as a person that is legally blind, what kind of accommodations do you use and how has that appeared in the workplace for you?
Yeah, and great question. And so for myself personally, I use a large print software on my computer. So I use Zoom Text. I know there's a lot of other software out there. So that's been something that I use. Now, having spent most of my career in human resources, specifically in employee relations, I so get this question. Okay, I so get this question because in dealing with employees and managers, that whole idea of special treatment and that concept of, gosh, why are they getting to come in late, right? When I have to be here at a certain time, those are tough conversations, right? And you know, from but it's important, as Chauncey said, is to set that tone and set that culture at the front end. Know what your processes are, right? Know who your employee relations or those folks in HR are that help to facilitate these requests and these accommodations. And then again, you know, present it in a way that is our company supports the needs of everyone. So in the event that you would ever have a need to for an accommodation, isn't it great that we have a process that supports that, right? So again, you know, pointing back to that policy and that process and the work that a company is obligated to do, right, under the ADA, it's important. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes in this space, you find special programs. Okay, special programs can often set that tone for special treatment. All right, so I'm gonna say that people with disabilities, you know, we are 35 years into the ADA. We are a part of America's workforce. And it doesn't matter, you know, getting out of that mindset of a special group of people that are hired to do a special job. We are beyond that. And so being mindful, right, of what that disability employment environment looks like in your organization is key there as well.
I would just add to that, because I was thinking about there's organizations that are small or little entrepreneurs that are just getting started, don't have an HR department. And say, okay, well, I don't know what to do. But, you know, there's resources out there. Obviously, there's training and education. I just think right now, I'm like listening to you talk and going, okay, well, I think if I didn't know quite what to do, maybe I'd call them and see if they could help me set up a way to educate my managers to understand better how to manage things, what's expected of them, to understand the rules. I mean, there's a ton of resources out there, but I realize that, you know, a small organization that can't go to HR and say, how do we do this? It might not have an HR department, or might have one person who's trying to figure it all out and doesn't have a lot of experience in this area, because there's expertise that people maintain and some that don't have it. So use the resources that are out there. There are so many resources, even getting on like LinkedIn Learning just to get an overview of something. It's an option to just get you educated. And I would agree with both you and Chauncey about that. It needs to feel organic to the organization. So if it's not there, start building it. You start building it. A value set that actually includes that and allows for an inclusive workplace, which is going to bring the team together and create. And it leads to productivity. I mean, it really does. The ultimate is the outcome will be actually beneficial to the organization and not just to, you know, the individual that's getting an accommodation.
100%. And the more easy that you make it to request accommodations and get accommodations, the more people within your organization benefit, because there's a lot of people that have invisible disabilities. Maybe they've been managing their condition for their entire life. They're afraid to talk about it. They're afraid to ask for an accommodation. So if you make it easier for one, you make it easier for all, and ultimately you make it more productive for all too. So Elizabeth, I imagine that working with peak performers, you probably had some tough love conversations, some coaching conversations where you've had to give negative feedback to employees with disabilities. So how do you handle that? Like, how do you handle that, especially when the disability may be a contributing factor to where there might be some performance problems?
Well, you know, I look at it, and again, as we were talking, you know, humans everyone's different, number one. So there isn't really a one size fits all response. But a good leader, and not just a manager, but a good leader, from my perspective, is someone who listens and responds in a way that's respectful. So I love the tough love thing, and I'm using that. I was thinking about that terminology, and I think I would import two words that I might use in place of those, which would be empathy and clarity. So, to be able to clarify the expectations that need to be met, but then to utilize empathy and respect, let them know, maybe at the outset you start, and this is, everyone's different, but let them know how valued they are in the organization and how you don't feel like the expectations are being met. Can you help me understand what's going on? Is there anything you need? Because even from the perspective of a non-disabled person, you may discover in that conversation from someone who just has something going on at home that's really critical for them, or they're having problems and they didn't talk about it. So they share that with you, and that allows you to have an empathetic conversation and then also reinforce what's expected. And if it turns out accommodations are needed because the person is falling behind because their learning style is different and they don't have that accommodation, then that's an opportunity to address it, but in a safe way where you set the tone, that this isn't, and it starts from the leader being an open door type of a person. If it's someone who doesn't seem to want to have conversations with any employees about anything or deal with it, it's not going to be easy to find out what's going on in order to correct it.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I totally agree with everything you said. And I think empathy, you used the word empathy, and I think empathy helps to build trust. I think just in general, whether the person has a disability or not. And I think when you build trust within your workforce, those tough conversations, quote unquote, become a little bit easier. I will say that in my experience, and Miles, I'm jumping in here, you didn't ask me to, but I hope it's okay. I think those difficult conversations are, so look, I've had situations where people don't have disabilities, just don't work out. They're not a good fit for certain jobs. I will say that in my experience, having those tough conversations with an individual with a disability is not any different, as has already been stated. But usually when you make the accommodations and you find out, okay, and focus more on what the abilities are, typically in an organization, most organizations at least, you can find something that is a good fit, or it may take a little bit more time, a little bit more different type of accommodation. Usually we're able to get there. And there have been situations in my experience where we haven't been able to get there, and we had to look at something different, right, for that individual where we could leverage their skill set. So I think being open-minded to different types of tasks that the individual might be able to do is something that I would encourage if you're able to do so, but not giving up, not being afraid. And then not having the answers and being a little fearful is okay. It's okay. As Elizabeth said earlier, do your research, right? As Beth was alluding to, some of us who work in larger organizations, there are big programs and departments that are established to assist and guide you. In smaller organizations, you may not have that, but there's plenty of information that's available. So as long as your heart is in the right place, I think that at the end of the day, things will work out. That's expected.
Yeah, and I will just add, and Chauncey, you're so right. It's about good management, right? And that's hard sometimes. What is a good manager? Well, a good manager is somebody that doesn't start with that tough conversation, right? That shouldn't be the first conversation you have with an employee, is that tough love conversation. So if you've built that trust, as you said, with your team, those tough conversations are going to be a lot easier to have.
I feel like the greater sin here is not hiring anybody with disabilities, therefore to not have those awkward conversations. So, or even worse, not saying anything, allowing a problem to persist and continue within the workplace. So it may be awkward at first, and you may feel like there is some danger to it, but the worst sin is just not saying anything or not doing anything, not taking any action too. How is reasonable accommodation determined, and by whom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what is reasonable? It's determined on a case-by-case basis, right? And typically, you're going to want to have that interactive conversation with the individual or employee with a disability. And what is reasonable? I mean, we can, again, the attorney in me, right, wants to go back to the ADA and talk about, undue hardship, right? We've all heard those things. I will tell you this, in the 20 plus years that I've worked in this space, I have yet to see a company have to close its doors because it's accommodated one too many people that asked for a low lumbar support chair. Okay. Now I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be flippant, and I get it. Okay. Cost is important, but the reality is, you don't have a number of people clamoring to say, hey, I'm a person with a disability, I need an accommodation, right? A reasonable accommodation is one, to me, that supports an individual with a disability to achieve the expectations, the performance expectations of the job that you've hired them to do. So is somebody going to come into your organization? And I'll use myself as an example. I know that I need large print software on my computer. So that's a pretty quick fix, right? That said, we have all been in positions where you're in a role and maybe 3 or 4 years down the road, something changes in that role. Maybe you have added responsibilities. That may require a tweak to my accommodation needs, right? Maybe it involves travel to some place. Maybe it involves some other skill set, or and because I don't drive, right, that might be an issue that I need to talk about at some point. If you're going to send me out making deliveries, right, in a truck as part of my role now, that's not going to work because I don't have a driver's license, and you don't want to take that risk, I promise you. But so again, an accommodation needs to be an ongoing conversation, right? It's not a one and done. And I think sometimes we think that we check that box and they've got the accommodation, it's in their file, and we never go back to it again. So again, it comes back to that relationship. As part of that performance review, how are things going? It's a great time to check in with that accommodation request. Is there, how are things going there? Is there anything else that we can do to support you to here at work? And those kinds of conversations are important to continue.
What I like to advise people is that start with maybe, or start with yes, right? Like start from a point of assuming that you can make it happen, or at least start from a point of considering it. Because what many people with disabilities experience, I read a stat recently that 76% of all people with disabilities have had an accommodation request flat out denied at least once in their career. So start from a point of saying yes, or at least maybe, and seeing if you can make it work. And I think that if you even shift your mindset to just that basic starting point, you'll find a lot more success with being able to grant accommodations and being more open-minded to exactly what it is a person that needs. And Beth was talking about ongoing costs. Also keep in mind that 56% of all accommodations cost $0, absolutely nothing. And the accommodations that do cost money, the average cost for them is less than $300. So this is not going to break the bank. This is not something that is, for most organizations, completely out of scope for them. Sometimes people at work are just mean. They say things either to your face, or they might say things behind your back that might be related to a disability that somebody experiences. As a manager, how do you manage this inter-office friction and people saying mean things?
Yeah, so I'll tell you, in my organization as a leader, I have zero tolerance for it, right? Whether a person has a disability or not. One, I just don't have time. I got to run a business, and I just don't have time for the quote unquote drama. And so, but yeah, I think addressing it in the moment directly and respectfully, right? And so I'll tell you, I had an example where we had to make an accommodation for an individual that had some severe social anxieties, and the way they showed up and how they acted was a little bit quirky, just because it was a little different, right? And I had an employee that was doing exactly that. And my approach was, and I'm probably 3 or 4 levels up from as a leader, right? There are 3 or 4 levels of leadership between myself and the front line at that time. And my approach, sitting from my seat, was to address it personally with that person. But I did it respectfully. I pulled the person into my office and outlined, one, what my expectations as a leader for anyone in my organization, whether they have a disability or not, in terms of conduct of behavior. And I was direct. And then I outlined what the consequences are if it were to continue, and very directly and in the moment. And so set that tone with that individual. And then I pulled my leadership team in after the fact and outlined the issue and then just reiterated the expectation. But again, I think it goes back to trust, right? I think it also, I'm that leader who walks around. I learn everyone's cat and the dog's name, the grandma, and I know all that. And so I'm doing that daily to Beth's point. So when it comes time to having those conversations, typically people know I'm coming from a good place, because one, I genuinely like getting to know my people, my employees, and I tend to find out a lot about the drama that's going on the production floor, quite frankly. So I'm kind of nosy as a leader. Has kind of been my approach. But addressing it directly, that's laughing. But addressing it directly and in the moment, and just being direct and just setting that tone, whether you are an executive leader or whether you're just a peer, right? So the other thing I encourage is that, for my team, whether you have a leadership title or manager title or not, if you're hearing something and it isn't correct, address it yourself in the moment and do it obviously respectfully in accordance with our expectations. But my job is to set the tone with every person in my organization that we have a zero tolerance for that type of behavior.
There's a problem with not only hiring people with disabilities across a wide range of industry sectors, but there's also a problem with retention. And a lot of that comes down to what people say behind somebody's back. And then furthermore, what actions are not taken. So it's on you, right? You have to say something, you have to do something, you have to take action in the moment, because you have to look out for not only your people, but your people with disabilities as well. I think that there's a pretty big perception out there by employers that our employees with disabilities are going to get hurt on the job more. So let's just talk about that, right? What would you say to that concern, and what steps can employers take to ensure that they have a workplace that is safe for everyone?
No, it's a great question, and it's not an uncommon one, right? When we're talking about this space, and I would say, newsflash, right? People are injured at work every day, People with disabilities and people without disabilities. And if you don't believe me, flip on your TV even now, and from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., tell me how many workers' comp attorney commercials you find on your TV. Right? Companies absolutely have policies related to workplace safety. Okay, that's a given, and that's a priority. It's important, not just for employees with disabilities, but for all employees. Safety first. I remember we used to, talk about that all the time within our distribution centers. Safety first. Safety first. Yes. Are there certain jobs? Are there certain disabilities that if you are hiring someone into a role, again, it's part of that accommodation conversation. Can they perform the essential functions of that job with or without accommodations? And obviously, can they do it safely? But here's the key, right? Safety can sometimes be replaced with kind of my own perceptions of what that individual can do safely. And I'll just examples, right? Falls, right? A risk of falling is a big deal. I remember, again, having conversations with managers when they would learn about a specific medical condition. Let's use epilepsy, for example. Well, what if, right? It breeds that. Well, what if they have a seizure on their way into the the office or into the parking lot, and they fall and they hit their head, and the what if? Yes. I mean, is that a risk? Absolutely it is. But what's the risk of someone arriving to work, getting out of their car, tripping over something and injuring themselves as well, or having a heart attack in the parking lot, right? With no precondition, nothing, it just happens. So I think what's important is that we need to balance that that concern around keeping employees safe, and that risk of injury with the reality, right, of what we do, and how we incorporate and how we accommodate people with disabilities in performing, again, the functions of their job. So, is it a challenge? Yes, it is. And is it something we need to pay attention to? Yes, it is. There are certain jobs like myself, right? As I said, I would not be in a role, hired into a role where I had to meticulously look at certain measurements. Let's say, okay, we're building a cabin right now. If you put me on a construction site and you want that wall straight, I'm probably not your person, right? Because visually, I just, that's just, it's tough for me. And is there an accommodation that would help me? Maybe. Now, would I be able to do something where I walk into a manufacturing plant, and if I am typing in certain measurements into a computer database, and this is real, right? Then they push that out there and it's a big copy machine, and I'm thinking of like a granite cutter, and the machine does it all itself. I just have to punch in the letter. I might be able to do that. You see what I'm saying? So there's so many, components to this, but again, I think it's on a case-by-case basis. We have to remember that and have those exploratory accommodation conversations to ensure that, one, employees are hired into roles that they can perform with or without those accommodations, and then that we don't necessarily overreact or assume that a person will not be safe based on a disability that they have.
I would just add to that, as someone who managed people on sites all across, Central Texas, and our pool was, 80% plus disabled, and the low number of actual workers' comp claims we would get in the course of a year. I mean, it was, so fear should not be an obstacle to bringing in someone who is qualified. And like you said, so if the job description, they can't match the job description, that's another story. And also, I was going to add to that, if in hiring, because I know this sometimes happens in hiring, people are afraid to even think about hiring someone because there's some perception and they don't really know how to ask. Well, most people with disabilities already know how to solve the problem if they've worked in a similar environment. So they might say, I know you know this about me, but if you have the kind of question and the kind of conversation, you know this about me, this is how, as long as I have this, I can make this situation work and I'll be productive. So it's, don't make assumptions. That's the thing. It's a bias. It's a bias that needs to be, removed. Ask the right questions and figure out how to help. Just don't let that fear get in the way.
As a person that's interviewing this person with a disability or managing this person with a disability, you may think that you need to solve everything for them. I promise you, you don't. They've been living with their condition and thinking about it a lot more than you have. So trust them when they say, I can do this, because ultimately that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that level of trust. And I would point out one other thing too, just to kind of dispel the rumors that might be circulating or people that might be skeptical in the audience. Walgreens put out a study about a decade ago that was measuring people with disabilities in their distribution centers. And they actually found that there was a lower rate of accident than there was among their non-disabled peers too. And this was a study over multiple different centers, thousands of different people. Again, people with disabilities know themselves, they know their body, they know their limitations. Don't feel like you have to take that on. Trust your people, trust your people. I want to kind of touch briefly on performance expectations, because sometimes there might be that perception out there that, oh, people with disabilities are going to do less than, they're going to be less productive, whatever. But how do you go about setting performance expectations?
It kind of comes back to the same thing we've been talking about, is that you have conversations, you set expectations, you try to be as empathetic as possible, but you reinforce the fact that this is still an expectation. It's that expectation that you need. What does a job description say you need to achieve? Well, we need you to get there. And how can we do that? And that sometimes brings out those things that people are afraid to talk about, and then you can address them in the moment.
Yeah, and Miles, I'd like to add to that if you don't mind. I mean, so this is a question that's near and dear to my heart, right? So I for many of my nearly 30 years at Wells Fargo, I managed back office operations, so sites all over the U.S. and then partnership sites in overseas in Philippines and India as well. And I call that out because every state, every region has slight different laws and expectations in terms of how you manage people with disabilities. But the one thing that remained constant for me was setting expectations, to Elizabeth's point. And I'll tell you, setting expectations up front, being accommodating in terms of getting to know the individual and adjusting where you can to accommodate. But again, we do that for everyone. And what I'll tell you is that as it relates to people with disabilities and as a person with disability, one of the things that kind of fuel my passion as a leader in this space is that the results I've seen across all the sites I've managed is that people with disabilities, when you set those performance expectations, for me, in my personal experience, the people that we hired with disabilities had less turnover, they had less HR issues, their productivity was on par, if not higher. And again, in operations, we look at productivity all day, every day, and it's a big deal in terms of how we know we're being successful. People with disabilities tended to, because they're so happy in general to have an opportunity, they came in usually with something to prove. So once you get over the hurdle of making the initial accommodations, whatever that might be, in my experience, just as a leader, although it's the right thing to do, it feels good, but really as I look at my bottom line, I want a team full almost of people with disabilities because I don't have the issues. I'm not on the phone with HR every other day, and their productivity is usually, again, higher, if not on par with others. And so setting those performance expectations, don't be afraid of it. If they qualify for the role, if we qualify for the role, we will, I'm speaking for myself, I'm coming in with something to prove.
Disability inclusion, accessibility, disability hiring, all of these things are just plain old good for business. And we need to shift our mindset away from, oh, this is an additional cost, this is an additional level of hurdles that we need to go through. It's just good for business. So what benefits have you observed from managing employees with disabilities, and what specific story can you share about one individual's journey?
Yeah. So one that comes to mind is the young lady who actually kind of spurred my interest in this space. So I had a coworker whose daughter was severely autistic, and he thought, and his wife thought, that she would never be able to live on her own, never work or anything. And so he asked if I would, consider giving her a job. And I said, sure. And again, I had never at that time engaged in this space. Long story short, she had severe social anxieties to the point where I found out that she was eating her lunch in the restroom stall. She would eat her lunch. She just had severe anxiety. But anyway, through accommodations, working with her, fast forward 15 years, she is got promoted several times. She was hired as a temp initially, hired full time. She's got her own apartment and is able to live on her own. And her dad, who came to me, he just gave me a hug, right? In tears, right? He's a man's man, kind of a guy who he just said, he appreciated us giving her the opportunity, and the fact that she is not only and now if you were to meet this young lady who's still with the bank, has been promoted several times, she will talk your head off, right? And in a great way, right? Where she had severe social anxieties, the opportunity to get employment, earn a paycheck, and to be amongst peers changed her life, changed their family's life. And her parents now feel as if, once they're gone, she'll be able to live independently, which was a big concern of theirs. And so that's probably my favorite story out of the many, many stories we have.
I love that.
Wow. So, you know what, and I'm going to say this is a little bit different in terms of the slant of this question, but I remember a situation because sometimes it's not just about the management of that employee, it's the manager's willingness to say yes to a hire. Okay. This particular individual was hired for a job in a distribution center. The distribution center was huge, like a 1,000,000 square foot distribution center. This individual had a hip issue, very severe hip issue. So walking that distance was significant. Even, using a mobility device to get from one end to the other. The long story short is he went through the training of this, in this process. As he completed the training and moved into the role, he realized that he was in over his head in terms of the distance he was required to walk and to do that in a distribution center that size. However, there are a number of distribution centers, okay? And the skills and the training that he received from this company led him to the opportunity for the next smaller distribution center job, and they jumped at the chance to hire this individual into a role in a separate company, different distribution center, because of the training he had experienced with the larger company. Okay, so did it work out for employer number one? No, it didn't. But the investment that employer took in that individual led him directly to a successful role that he could perform in employer number two, that was a smaller distribution center setting. And that's what it's about, right? It's a manager that is willing to just say, yes, let's do this. Let's find a way and make this successful.
And if you're watching this right now, you could be that manager. You could be that person that gives somebody their shot. You could be that person that says, yes, maybe let's figure it out. So that would be the challenge that I would give to each of you. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Until next time, this has been Miles from Peak Performers and all of us from Disability in Central Texas. Thanks for tuning in.